Victoria, we saw bits from the Quiet Mutiny there. Would they have caused such revelations, such behind-the-scenes ructions, if they'd simply been published in the newspaper at the time? Would they have been published in the newspaper in 1970 or now?
Well, I lived in Saigon at that time, 1970. And I can't think of a single journalist who would have been interested to spend that amount of time, or even to look at the issue of what those kids, they were basically, were doing or thinking. A bit later on, it became quite fashionable for American media to take up specifically drugs and alcohol and suicides among soldiers, but it wasn't before. But I want to say one other thing about that film and the row that it caused, because the American ambassador who made the row was not only a personal friend of the President of the United States, he was a friend of our Queen, who actually holidayed in his wonderful house in California. So you can see why the executives of television completely panicked when they saw this film and the criticism. But
Yeah.
no writing journalist could possibly have written that story, taken the time, got the access, and I don't think our editors would have been interested.
No. Ken, I don't think politicians attacking television programmes in those days was confined to documentaries, was it? You were the same sort of response to Cathy Come Home and Up the Junction in the 1960s.
Well, I think John's films were a direct challenge to power, weren't they? I mean, they weren't speaking truth to power, they were challenging them on behalf of truth. And I think that's the big difference. I mean, he took them on. And I think, and the documentary format that's the format you can do it, because in fiction, it's wrapped up in characters and plot. In documentary, there's the facts. That's the accusation, there's the evidence. And he did it so precisely, and there's no room for equivocation. I mean, he'd have had a riot with Starmer. Working people, for God's sake. But I think the danger is people became, towards the end, became aware of who he was, and certainly people in the West. My impression was walked away from being confronted by him because they knew he would tear them to shreds. But I think the other thing that struck me was that the clarity, but the way the documentaries were made. I mean, they were brilliantly made, and they were made with cameramen. There were no self-shooting documentaries. The directors here, cameramen and editors. I mean, one of the editors here is here tonight, Jonathan Morris, who cut Year Zero, and did a brilliant job. And I think that's the art of making those very precise, clear documentaries is one I look for now, and I'm afraid those who are in charge of television will not pay for proper crews and craftsmen, because it's a craft, and the precision and the accuracy and the making that charge stick, you need real craft to do it. And these films, these are models of what documentaries should be.
Richard, we've obviously seen the impact that John made with those revelations from Vietnam in the Quiet Mutiny. His documentaries continued to upset the broadcasting authorities when he made the Pilger series for ATV. Can you describe the television landscape of the time and how you used John's documentaries to get the idea of personal view films accepted as mainstream?
Okay. I'm going back 50 years. And 50 years ago, there were just 3 television channels. and we're describing as BBC One and BBC Two and ITV. I would argue it was slightly different from that. It was BBC One certainly and BBC Two, but it was ITV and the IBA. And the IBA's statutory job, and we've seen them there, but its statutory job was to regulate commercial television. And that statutory job marked down in its statutory affairs that it had to have balance.
Objectivity and
Objectivity, impartiality and balance in every programme. Right. So my job was to find a way in which John's films went out. Right? And not just John's, but Ken's and Anthony's and a whole bunch of others. So you're rather gracious when you first of all introduced me as coming as his deputy head. It's not strictly true. I actually arrived at ATV because 2 years after John, had spent for World in Action, had spent a year in Belfast as the so-called producer of World in Action there. Not quite true. I was a researcher, and it clearly wasn't a very big job because they sent me. And when it was over, the two people that ran World in Action was Gus MacDonald and John Burt. And when I got back, Gus MacDonald said to me, "Richard, you can go and make any programme you want. And if it goes up with name on it, we'll put it out." So I made a programme about the hooded men. And to make it as realistic as possible, I decided to go for reconstruction in World in Action. So I got the people who had been hooded and tortured, and they took me to the places they'd been. And I then got them to reenact exactly what had happened to them. And it was, as Ken said, a really good film crew. It was, in my view, pretty good. Gus MacDonald took one look and buried it. Right? It never saw the light of day. And from that day on, I was taken off World in Action. I ended up in arts programs at Granada until eventually I found Charles Denton at ATV, and he took me on for a year on a researcher's contract. The very first programs I made were the Pilger series in America with a man called Richard Barkrant. Now, I think so that's the background. So I understood very much that there was a real need to find a way in people who made films like John, subjective films, got through the system and kept on being there. And that's what really brought me to ending up, when Charles Denton became the director of programs, as his successor as head of documentaries. So a pretty big leap from being a researcher to a head of documentaries. And I remember going around Hammersmith on my bike to get to Marble Arch, where ATV had its office. And I had one of those kind of light bulb moments, and I said, the only way that I am going to be able to enable people like Ken, like Anthony, like Adrian, like so many others to make programs, was to change the style in which programs were made and call it publishing. And therefore I would publish people's films. And I would do all I could to do nothing but enable them to do the very best they could and get it out. I never had to justify a film. My job was to justify the fact that it needed to be shown. And I think that was the environment in which we led. It was quite clear that World in Action would never make another film with John. Right? It was quite clear that the normal way in which you ran departments was as heads of departments who said, this is what you do. So I think that became the change, and that in a way, I would argue, is what happened to Channel 4. Now, I should just mention that I think John's year zero was a complete turning point. It wasn't just a turning point in what we saw on the film there, although I think it was terrific. It was a turning point for a number of other reasons too. For it was the very first time in which any hour-long documentary had gone out on commercial television with no adverts. Right? It was the very first time that we came back from it, and John and David Munro arrived when there was a strike on, and he was told that there was no way in which the film could be edited because there was an ACTT strike. there was quite a lot of underground work going on to do it, and Johnson Morris also did a lot of underground work going on. And so I was aware that I would get that to happen. And I was aware that if I guaranteed that I would not pay Jonathan any money, but the money I would have paid went to the ACTT, and if we took the film into Soho away from the studios, I could get away with it, and we did.
It could be made on
It could be
humanitarian
done,
grounds, yeah.
just because it was so powerful. One little part of that story is that there were no studios being used in the Birmingham studios because there was a strike on. So as soon as the film was transmitted, and it took 8 days to do something, it should have taken weeks, or maybe a couple of weeks to do it. The studios were empty, so I took over the studios, and we counted hundreds of thousands of pounds, which were sent in by people all over the country, into those studios. And at the end of the day, over £4 million have been brought in to the UK alone to be sent off to Cambodia. So that was the climate in a way. I think there's, well, let me stop there with the other questions, but
Yes.
because my job in a way is to tell you how you keep John's programs on the
But you
air.
persuaded the IBA to take what was seen as personal view programs, basically.
Yes,
Sure.
but just about. I mean, there were personal view programs and balance programs and balance series,
Yeah.
because my job was to enable the IBA not to do what it was statutorily told it had to do.
Right. Christo, how did it come about that your company, Dartmouth Films, took over production of John's documentaries?
Well, I think the reason was because ITV weren't willing to provide him with the budget that he thought he needed. I think anyone who worked with John
I think
knows
their
that he was
budget-
no
I
respecter
think their
of
budget stayed the
budgets.
same, didn't it?
Yes,
His
that's right. Yeah,
expectations went up, yeah.
he, as Ken has alluded to, John's films were not cheap to make, we had. This was 2008, and I'd known John for years, so for a number of reasons. But we had just released a film in British cinemas at that time. Called The End of the Line, which is a film about the threat to the world's oceans from overfishing. And it was the first big theatric documentary that had been made in this country for a very, very long time. And there are lots of reasons why we were able to do that. And it was such an event, it was even covered on the ITV 9 o'clock news. And so John got in touch with me and said, look, I want to make another film for ITV, but they've given me a budget for it. I'll tell you what it was. They've given me £250,000. And I think it was the first time anyone had sort of said to him, this is the sort of money it costs to make one of your films. Actually, it costs a lot more than that, by the way, right? So he said, and do you think you can help me make it? So there were three things that I knew that we might be able to do. That John had a big following. I thought there probably were one or two philanthropists or foundations that might support it. I knew that we could get a tax break on it because of the way the British tax system works, supporting independent film. And I also thought that probably I could talk John down a bit on the budget question. Yeah, quite. That was a forlorn hope. Anyway, but the thing, so what we did succeed in doing was raising the rest of the money for the film, which was, we more than doubled the amount of money we got from ITV. But that's the reason why he came, because he thought that, he'd seen that we'd done it once, and he thought we might be able to do it for him. Yeah.
Yes. Back to Victoria, moving on to a subject that's topical yet again. John made two documentaries 28 years apart, both with the title Palestine is Still the Issue. How difficult is it to tackle the subject of Israel and the Palestinians?
Well, I'd like to say one thing. I have to read it because I want to get the exact words. When John's 2002 film came out, he had the most amazing betrayal by the producer of the film and the owner of Carlton Communications. That was Michael Green, chair of the board of Carlton, and this is what he said. The film was one-sided, it was totally unrealistic, it was John Pilger, factually incorrect, historically incorrect. I think that betrayal could have ended John's career, and it was certainly meant to. But what Ken just said about John's professionalism and the teams around him meant that the two inquiries were into the factual content of the film, and Green was completely sidelined. But the fact is that that criticism of John hung around him a bit for a long time. And I think it was one of the sort of, as I said, a great betrayal, but it was also, it set a tone in which it was sort of easy to criticize John. And you could say things like, he's always so one-sided, or he's unprofessional, all the things that Green said. Whereas the truth is that that 2002 film was one of the most carefully made, best researched films, documentaries that I've ever seen.
And that's what the
And one of
ITC
the-
said in response to complaints. The ITC, then the television regulator, said exactly that and totally vindicated the film.
But I think this question of John's professionalism is an incredibly important thing for us to bear in mind. And a lot of the way that he made those films was so difficult, so incredibly logistically difficult. And you couldn't make that film. A Western television company will not make a film in Israel and Palestine today, partly because the Israelis banned all Western journalists. Secondly, because the authorities, editors, and management are so terrified of being called anti-Semitic that it's like a curse on trying to make the kind of films that John made about Palestine. But actually, the whole scene is completely different in terms of the way everything is structured. And what is coming out of Gaza today is immense amount of incredible footage by Palestinian journalists. And Al Jazeera made a very, very good film called War Crimes. And I can't imagine it will be shown on British television. And in one way you can say that doesn't matter because it's streamed on all sorts of different platforms. You can find it on YouTube. But the fracturing of people watching something collectively is gone. And it's possible for the authorities to completely sideline all these kind of films. And there's another point I want to make about that film, or this films of today, that 140 journalists have been killed in Gaza in a year. I don't know if you know how many journalists were killed in Vietnam in that long, long war. 69. World War II, 60. So if you look at think about the numbers and the fact that most of those people received a warning from the Israeli army. We know where you are. We're coming for you, to try and stop them. And they haven't stopped. So I think that I miss John tremendously every day at this time, because I know he would have found a way to force Christo to help him make a film using the footage that is available in alliance with Palestinian journalists. So no, they're one-offs, what John did.
Ken, what was it like working in the same documentary department as John at Central in the 1980s?
Well, it was a very good place to work, and thanks to Richard and the team. It was a place in Charlotte Street, and there were a bunch of troublemakers there, and we all got on very well. I mean, unfortunately, and I know this was not Richard's fault. My experience was not quite as good as John's in a way, because most of mine were banned, which was because I think they may not have been such good films, but the they were dealing with things about British politics, and particularly the miners' strike, which Channel 4 and Channel 4 particularly refused to show. They simply said, we will not show these. And it was straight political censorship, and it was a hard battle to fight. John was a huge support, as were many others, Anthony and others. But it was a tough battle, which Richard couldn't win, and fought hard for us, but we couldn't win because the board of Central TV wouldn't back the films. And I think, again, and so I think we tend to forget that in the end, the BBC and the broadcasters, they are an arm of the state. And there are times when they will be liberal, when they feel very confident, and there are times when they tighten the noose of what you can say. And I think now is a time when it is very hard to say things. And I think what John's theme throughout his work is a collusion of the Western powers led by the states, but followed in a subservient way by the various British governments, now more than ever. And Blair's imitation of Bush's cowboy walk is a kind of symptom of that kind of dog-like, spaniel-like following of the cowboy pretending to be one in the Iraq War debacle. And that collusion of the West with tyranny, with violence, with wars, with the disregard for international law, which John showed very clearly in his Iraq films. Disregard for international law. And yet if you torture yourself with Today in Parliament, which I tend to do at 11:30 at night, there was one of his noble lords saying that, spoke of the characteristic of Britain was respect for the law. I don't know what planet he's living on. And there was no respect for international law, no respect whatsoever. There wasn't in Iraq, there isn't now in the war between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. There is no regard for international law. We know what the international law says. Disregard it. Weapons supplied in collusion with ignoring international law. And so that ongoing theme, I mean, has never been more needed to expose that, what is happening than now. And it's so sad that John isn't here. And it's so sad that people of talent, and that there are always people with talent, who will continue that tradition, don't find the space, as Victoria said, on our channels, to make those clear statements. And when people say, well, he was one-sided, well, sure. But when you have the mass of the mainstream media pursuing one line, which is clearly false, then you need the voices that say, wait a minute, what you're saying is not true. And your position is untenable. And that's what John did. And that's why it was so important. And that's the role of documentaries. So anyone involved in making documentaries, this is what you've got to do.
Victoria, Paying the Price, Killing the Children of Iraq, it was a film you championed when you were at The Guardian. I remember John telling me you implored journalists and executives there to watch it, and it changed the paper's editorial policy. It had previously given qualified support to sanctions. 2 days later, after seeing it, the paper ran an editorial demanding that non-military sanctions be suspended.
Well, John was too generous and overstated my influence. I think that what really happened was that the leader writer of the day saw the film, and there was no way, having seen the film, that he wasn't going to write it differently. But there's another thing about that film I'd like to say, which is that most of the core of it was obviously within the hospitals, talking to the mothers and as we saw here, and the doctor. But there were two very significant people in that film. The United Nations head of the terrible sanctions program. The first was Dennis Halliday, and the second was Hans von Sponeck, a distinguished German diplomat. And both of those men resigned from their jobs. And that did more to alert people to how the UN was being distorted by the Security Council, that men of principle would not work on that program. Both of them are still, 20 years on, extremely active, but they never got the profile that John gave them. And when I think about the parallels now, there have been resignations, but they've all been fairly low-level people who appear on obscure programs that some of us watch, but they're not in the mainstream. And I think that was such a contribution of John's, and another reason why that's one of his most important films.
Thank you. Can I take some audience questions
Can
now?
I
Who wants
just
to-
make an observation on
Chris,
that question about him making films about British subjects? Because it's of the 4 films that we produced with him, obviously the last one is absolutely a British subject. And the film that I was talking to him about before he became ill, for the film he next wanted to make, was going to be about British prisons. He'd been very, very exercised about the condition in British prisons when he went to meet because he saw Julian Assange a lot when Julian was in prison, and he said it is just absolutely appalling what's going. I mean, absolutely it is, and it's how prescient of him to see it. Anyway, obviously he didn't live long enough to do that. And in the War You Don't See, there's a very substantial section of that, which is a fulsome assault upon the BBC particularly, and the BBC turned up. It's interesting what you said, Ken, that except for the National Health Service, he did always get people to turn up. We still did manage in the first 3 films to get sort of people on the other side. They knew what they were letting themselves in for,
Right.
but they still felt obligated to do
Good.
it. So I think, and I'm thinking about that, I think, we were lucky with those 4 films. A lot of the work that you had done had created a space within the ITV network. I mean, he made the films at whatever length he thought appropriate. Which, and that's why they were always shown after the news. We had, he worked with lawyers there he'd worked with for a long time. And I think that, that all, he was, in that respect, space had been created for John to do the work that he wanted to do, in a much freer way, perhaps, than he had in previous years. And he definitely was, I mean, he was 80 when he made the last film, and it was obvious when he was making it that it was there's a big strain on him, and that's, I think, what he wanted to get his teeth into what was going on in Britain next.
I would argue, and I agree with what you're saying about British films, it was difficult to commission John to make films about the UK. It's difficult to get films off the ground, and it's difficult to make them. So you have to really think your way through it. I did that with John on a subject which he was incredibly passionate about, as he was on every subject, and that was Britain creating nuclear power stations. And I knew we'd have an enormous problem if we did a film about Britain creating nuclear power stations. So in Unjustifiable Risk, he made most of the film in Hiroshima. And he was then able to use, in John's way, exactly telling us about a British subject, but taken overseas. So I think I would argue that we can do it, but we have to really think how you do it. You mustn't just go straight on, because in my experience over 14 years doing that job, you'll probably hit a dead wall. And after I left television, I met up and set up a company with Douglas Adams to see what was beyond television. So I would say to people, if we don't have the broadcasters, do feel free, do embrace the fact you can get anything you want on the internet by YouTube and elsewhere. So we don't always have to look at the broadcasters, but we always have to think ahead, or else you won't get that.
And just something to add to what Richard said. You make a good point, Richard. I mean, I think the subtext of what you said is actually, yes, it is harder to make directly documentaries about British conflicts because they are more censorious. I mean, you know, and you have to guide away. We'll find a detour that allows us to make the point. And that's something we have to challenge. I mean, don't want to talk about my experience, but I mean, they were industrial subjects were what we got banned. And I think there were a total of 6 films altogether, 6 films that were banned during the Thatcher period because they were about workers fighting back against Thatcher's attack and mass unemployment, factory closures, and the poverty that brought, and the insecurity that brought, and the lining up of the miners to be the last battle that was fought, and the significance of that, and the collusion of Kinnock and Hattersley in failing to support the miners. And in fact, when it was a choice between do you support Thatcher's attack on the working class or do you support the miners, they chose to support Thatcher by refusing to organise support for the miners in their pivotal position as leaders of the Labour Party. That's never been really thoroughly analysed and looked at. And we did it to an extent, and they refused to show it. And I think that this is something we really got to challenge. We try to challenge. We've really got to challenge, you know, and the younger ones have got to do it now. You've got to challenge the fact that broadcasting, our main means of communication as a society, that in hearing the news, in writing the news, because somebody writes it, they select what's happening and say, these are the words we're going to use. This is the order we're going to tell the stories. These are the people we're going to speak to. Challenging that and say, you have to have the genuine diversity of opinion that there is in the nation and not manipulate it and create a consciousness which suits the establishment. Because that's exactly what they do. They create a consciousness that suits power. And that's what we have to challenge.